My name is Punya Mishra. I am Associate Dean and Professor at the Mary Fulton Teachers College. And I'm trying something different here rather than a regular keynote to see if stuff shows up on the right-hand side. We'll see if it works or not. I'm really excited to join all of you this evening here from Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm sure it's morning of Saturday in Shanghai at the 18th Shanghai International Curriculum Forum. And the topic that I'm going to talk about is TPACK and beyond, designing technology and education from artifacts to culture. And it's kind of sad that we're stuck in this COVID-19 situation where we are all just looking at each other through these little windows on a computer. I mean, it's crazy to think about it. Like back in February, this is what the world was like, where it was just China and Mongolia, which had like schools shut down. And by mid-March, this is what the world looked like, where we had in 2 months 194 countries and 1.6 billion learners were out of school, out of figuring out, and schools and countries and nations were trying to figure out how to sort of navigate this COVID-19 crisis. And one thing that everybody sort of started leading on was this idea of remote learning, and technology suddenly became sort of the savior. Like that became the way that we could continue to do the important work that we do. And over the past 7, 8 months now, Zhao, we have been doing the Silver Lining for Learning every Saturday with Shanghai as well, where we get people from across the world to talk to us about how they are handling this, if there is something positive that is emerging from this crisis. And it's been fascinating. I think the single most important thing that has emerged for me personally is how connected we are as educators. Even though we are sort of sitting in our own homes and situations so on, the commitment and passion for teaching and learning that educators have shown, the willingness to step outside of their comfort zone to take care of students and learners has truly been incredibly inspiring. And when you think about this thing about what role technology and learning can play together, the work that I have done in the past is around sort of the TPACK framework, which is this question of, which suddenly becomes very important for almost everybody, is what is it that teachers need to know to intelligently integrate technology in teaching and learning. And so that brings me to the TPACK framework, and it would be remiss of me not to mention or bring up my colleague Matt Kaler's name, because Matt and I sort of worked on this together. Everything, if you look up, it's always Mishra, Kaler, Mishra. And I don't think this work would have happened without Matt's sort of constant, this partnership that we had. Matt, if you know Matt and me, and Young can speak to that, we are very different from each other. Matt is this big 6 foot whatever guy from Wisconsin. I am this relatively shorter brown guy from India. Funnily enough, he is vegetarian, I am not. But despite all of that, we worked out, I think, a really wonderful partnership, which sort of helped us articulate what is it that teachers need to know if they have to sort of integrate technology in their teaching. And so this brings me to, so what I try to do is frame this conversation of this presentation in terms of some key questions. So first question I think that I want to address is, what is this thing called the TPACK framework, and why should we care about it? Why is that important? So what is the TPACK framework? Very simply, the TPACK framework is actually at some level very trivial. I think good teachers and good educators have always understood this. They've always understood that good teaching lies at the intersection of what it is that you want to teach, which is the subject matter. So it could be science, it could be mathematics, it could be music, it could be literature. And certain approaches that we have to convey this knowledge, which is the pedagogy, right? So you could think about if it should be in small groups, whether it is online, whether it is a whole class lecture. So that's sort of the pedagogical approach that you're looking to. And finally, it has always been about the tools that we have to convey that knowledge. And when we talk about technology, Matt, and it suddenly looked like as if I have dropped out of Zoom. Can you see me?
You're
Okay,
good.
sorry.
You're good. You're very good.
Okay, sorry about that. It looked like I had suddenly something went wrong with my screen here.
Now you're good.
Okay, thank you. So, coming back to this thing that when Matt and I talk about technology, we do not just mean digital technology. Technology, paper and pencil is a technology. A whiteboard or a blackboard is a technology, as are apps and social media, PowerPoint, whatever you think about. Because those are all things that we as humans have created. So it's important to understand that all teaching and learning has always been at this intersection of what it is that we want to teach, what approaches we use to teach it, and the tools that allow us to instantiate or help enhance that learning. And so educators have always existed in that little star over there, which is the intersection of technology, pedagogy, and content. So for instance, if you take an example of a high school maths teacher and let's say a high school literature teacher, the kinds of tools and technologies each of them will use will be very different. Because a high school maths teacher has to focus on using things like simulations, using things like that allow students to visualize and understand mathematical relationships and concepts. While a language arts teacher or a literature teacher is going to focus on helping students write better. And writing better maybe requires peer review, maybe it requires them to use something like a wiki, something like, and so on, right? And so the point is that at any time, whenever we are thinking about conveying some information, conveying some knowledge, it has to be at the intersection of these three things. And what's been interesting in terms of why we should care, why this is important, it is important because what the TPACK framework does is that it gives an analytic framework for us to think about the kinds of decisions we make when we teach and learn. And any framework that we create is a representation of reality and hence has to be an abstraction of that reality. Which means by its very nature, it is going to mislead us in some way. The question then becomes, is this representation helping us? And I think this is where the TPACK framework becomes important because it is simple, but it's not simplistic. It respects the complexity of teaching and learning using technology. I think secondly, why we should care about it is because what the TPACK framework does, it takes you beyond sort of technocentrism. It takes you beyond saying we need to focus on the technology, but it says that it's not just the technology. It is a technology, yes, that is an important component, but as maybe more important as what it is that we want students to learn and what the approaches that we're using. So it's that intersection of that. And finally, and maybe most important, is that dotted circle that we have around the TPACK framework, which is the context. Because the context is critical, because without appreciating, so for instance, I work with some schools in India where you may or may not have electricity some days a week, you may be going to a lab. That's a very different context for learning than in a situation where students have devices that they can access all the time. The kind of teaching and learning you can do in one context is different from the other. So respecting that context becomes really important. What's been heartening for Matt and me and really exciting has been the amount of the impact that this framework has had both on research and on practice. And this is from April, from the TPACK newsletter. I'm just taking some data from there, which is there have been almost more than 1,200 articles, almost 300 book chapters, 28 books, and what's most exciting to me as an academic is 400 plus dissertations. And all of these don't just cite the TPACK framework, they actually use the TPACK framework as a way of analysis, as a way of thinking and doing research. But even more important than that is the manner in which this framework has been taken on by universities, colleges, and schools across the world for thinking about how we can develop the next generation of educators and use for professional development of teachers. So that is very meaningful to both me and Matt. The fact that we sat on the 5th floor of Erickson Hall and talked and discussed and came up with and wrote these papers, and that it has had this impact across the world. So that's really exciting. I know that the TPACK handbook has been translated into Chinese, and that's really, in fact, Shanghai just told me that the professor who translated, I think it was Professor Ren, just was speaking earlier today. So that's really meaningful to us because it means the work that we do has had an impact above and beyond sort of just being used in journal articles. One of the things that the TPACK framework sort of brings up, and a lot of the work I have done in between sort of the TPACK and now, is this idea of teacher creativity. And I think it's really important to understand that the technologies and the tools that we have around us, like this one that we're using for Zoom, for instance, or what I'm doing with, trying to do with these slides over here, were not designed for education. And so it is up to educators to think about these tools and technologies in new ways and to repurpose them for educational needs. And I think that's an important aspect of teacher development and teacher professional development and teacher education that we need to focus on, is how do we help them become creative users of technology. And in one of the Silver Lining for Learning sessions that we had, Shanghai shared some images of teachers in China, who, I remember this one, I don't know Zhao if you remember this, where they had this chair where they had taped a cell phone to make it an overhead projector. Like, the chair was not designed for that purpose, the cell phone was not designed for that purpose, but as educators what we do is we take what we have, the resources we have, and think about them creatively. And I think that's an important part of the work that I have done, is thinking about how do we think about creativity, how do we think about teacher creativity, and I can talk a lot more, if the questions come up, around this idea of transdisciplinary creativity and so on. Now, one of the questions that I always ask myself is what is missing when we talk of TPACK? And part of it is this issue of why has education not changed? I mean, why do we still have similar kind of classroom structures, similar kinds of educational systems, when we know that the potential for this technology, is quite dramatic. And what this has led me to think about is going beyond just the TPACK framework and thinking about seeing education as being this system which has been designed by us and has been created either by a deliberately designed or it has just by historical circumstance it's been designed. And I think it's really important to understand that the structures that we have today are just made up by us. We made all this stuff up. We made up this idea of a building where kids go for a certain amount of hours in a day, and that's where they learn, and then they come back home and they lead their lives. We have made up the system of, that you will be in this class for 15 minutes, and then you will go have recess for 30 minutes, and then you will come back, and now you'll do something else for 50 minutes. All of this stuff is just made up by us. There is no absolute need for it to be X or Y, and this is something Yang and I have been talking about quite a bit, is like how the learner, and I think Yang is going to talk about that in his part, how the learner has become decentered from these systems. And design, at the end of the day, is a structure adapted to a purpose. And if we think about our educational system not producing the results that we want, if we think that our students are not creative thinkers, if we think that our students are not entrepreneurial, if we think that our students are not questioning assumptions, if we think that our students are rote memorizers, it's because we have designed the system that way. And I think it's really incredibly important for us as educators to acknowledge that and realize that. Because it's only by accepting that, then we can start thinking about how we can design new forms of teaching and learning. And so, when we talk about design in education, what is it that we design when we design in education? And this brings me to my current work that I've been doing, which we call the 5 spaces for design in education. Because as we started thinking about the role of design, we realized that design could be used to design an app, a lesson plan, a student experience, an admission system, an evaluation system, and a broader culture. And so, thinking that the way these pieces work are very different from each other, so we need to get just smarter about how we think about design. So this is the way we have been sort of articulating it, that the 5 spaces for design are what we call artifacts, processes, experiences, systems, and culture. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them, and then I'll sort of conclude my talk. So first is when you think about artifacts. These are relatively stable objects that can be perceived by our senses. So it could be a piece of technology like a laptop. It actually could be a chair in a classroom. Because the way we think about chairs or tables in a classroom can dramatically change how we interact with each other. One of my close friends, Sean Lesher, who runs this urban school district in San Diego, has this phenomenal blog post about where the teacher's chair is placed. If the teacher's desk is placed in the front, it sends a different message than if the teacher's desk is placed in a slightly different place. So artifacts carry meaning. They carry, and they can change the way we interact with each other and with learning. The second thing we talk about that we can design are processes. Processes are procedures or direction that can be used to achieve a certain goal. And whether it is about student admission, or whether it is how we set up the calendar, or how students can navigate through an educational system before they graduate, those are processes that we have created. And those are processes that hence we can change and redesign. The third, and to me this is maybe the most important level, at some level, is the kind of experiences that we are creating for our learners. And when we talk about experiences, we mean it's a piece of time with associated sights, sounds, thoughts, and most importantly, feelings. Have we created spaces where students feel comfortable? Have we created spaces where they feel they have ownership over their learning and how they want to go? And this is something I think Young will speak about in a few minutes, much more forcefully than I will. The next level that we think about what we have designed are these systems. These are organized and purposeful structure of interdependent and interrelated elements. So this could be how students get financial aid. It could be how we think about grading and how the evaluation students use. It could be a range of different systems which interact with making the student experience important and crucial. So that's, I think, so to me, my work now has really started focusing on the kinds of systems that we have created that allow for learning and teaching to happen. And finally, we have to think in terms of designing a culture. It's a pattern of shared assumptions and values that allows groups to make and transmit meaning. And if you see the second image there, it's a little bus, and this bus rides around here in Phoenix. And one of the things we did as a part of this work, we actually went and interviewed the president of the university. 15 years ago, when President Michael Crow came to Arizona State was known for being a party university. This is where students went not to learn, but to have a good time. In 15 years, he has completely transformed that. And he had to approach this work as a designer. He had to choose who he would hire and who he would let go, what kind of interdisciplinary projects he would support, where he would put his resources, and what that has led to is an university which for the last 6 years now is regarded as the most innovative university in the nation. And so I think it's really important what he has developed is a culture in this university which frames and focuses on innovation, focuses on student learning, and that he had to approach as a designer. And so when we think about this 5 spaces for education and thinking back to the TPACK framework, I think the TPACK framework focused on artifacts, which is the technology, processes about how students or teachers would learn and use those technologies, and to a certain extent of experiences. So in some ways, I think the TPACK framework does a really good job of that. However, I think it misses issues of systems and culture. And that unless and until we think about the broader systems and culture within which these technical tools or the technological tools and curriculum and all of these things happen, we will not have significant and systematic change. This is one of my favorite quotes about education, and it says that the process of education is not a natural phenomenon. It is human-made. We made this stuff up. And it's designed to serve our purposes and meet our needs. I think very often students do not see that. Students see this as being something that has been imposed on them. And that's a problem, because then they don't feel that they have an ownership over their learning and their development. And so if we think about both, and if we think fundamentally about educational research, which all of us as academics are involved in, seriously, educational research is not in need of research to find out how it works. That's the job of natural science, to figure out how gravity works and how biochemistry works. We are in a world which is artificial in design, so what we need is creative innovation to make it work better. And I think that's incredibly important for us to see ourselves not as studying something, but really studying it in order to improve. And I think that's and so just coming to the end of my little talk here, is that the only hope we have for sustainable change in education is to recognize its artificiality. Because we take these things for granted, and like we always talk about, okay, when do we get back to the normal? And I think China in some ways has sort of gotten back to the normal post-COVID, while all the rest of the world is still trying to figure it out. But that normal is made up. It's not normal as in a tree is normal, which is a natural thing. All of these things are created by us, and it's only when we engage in design across these 5 spaces that I think we can hope to leave it better than we found it when we came into that space. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I want to just thank all of you for this opportunity, and that's my contact information, and I look forward to Q&A, and look forward to hearing Zhao talk, and we'll take it from there. Thank you very much.